Hi everyone, welcome back to the Current History video blog. Today I am going to be going into some history, but in the context of the recent Super Bowl halftime performance by Bad Bunny and a few other artists. And what was interesting to me about this was a specific performance by Ricky Martin, which touched on U.S. history and its brief flirtation with imperialism. So, unless you were just not paying attention at all, a few weeks ago, millions of Americans were watching the Super Bowl halftime show which was controversially headlined by Latin artist Bad Bunny, who was Puerto Rican descent, actually a native-born U.S. citizen, who performed entirely in Spanish. And this ruffled some feathers. But what I want to focus in on is not that controversy. It's something that was, I think, somewhat overlooked, which was in the middle of that performance, Ricky Martin, who is Grammy Award-winning Latin artist. Many a millennial knows exactly who he was with his big hit, Livin' La Vida Loca, back in 2000. But he did not sing a party anthem. He sang more of a emotional, meaningful song, which was called Lo que le pasó a Hawaii, which translates into what happened to Hawaii. And this was a warning that specifically ties into Puerto Rico's current, are they a state, are they not a state, do they want to be one status? You know, they're a territory, but all their residents are U.S. citizens, but they have no representation in the U.S. government. So this song specifically drew a direct comparison between Hawaii's history and Puerto Rico's history and present. So Hawaii was once an independent kingdom, and then around 1893, there was a coup that overthrew Hawaii's queen that was led by a cabal of American businessmen with some help by U.S. Armed Forces and mercenaries. The president at the time, Grover Cleveland, had a personal relationship with the Queen of Hawaii, considered her a friend, and refused to entertain annexation. But the next president, William McKinley, was not so reticent. He had run a campaign of American greatness, American expansionism, somewhat echoes Trump's 2024 campaign. And so in 1898, it was annexed by the United States and later became a state. This annexation happened around the time of the Spanish-American War, in which the U.S. was victorious over Spain and acquired many of Spain's overseas territories, among them Guam and the Philippines in the Pacific Ocean, and Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. So Cuba was quickly given independence. Puerto Rico was not, and it became a U.S. territory and was in a similar state as Hawaii at the time. So, over time, much of its land shifted into outside ownership. Most of Hawaii's land shifted into outside ownership. Its economy became tourist-dependent, and Native Hawaiian political sovereignty basically disappeared as subsumed into the United States. And so this song that Ricky Martin sang asks whether Puerto Rico is heading down the same path. As Hawaii moved toward incorporation, it became a U.S. territory, and eventually the 50th state in 1959. Puerto Rico followed a different model. It became an unincorporated territory. Again, residents are U.S. citizens, and they lack representation in Congress. The island governs itself locally, but sovereignty ultimately resides in Washington. So for decades after this, the United States described itself as fundamentally anti-imperial, especially compared to the European powers. This these territories acquired around 1900 were the only overt flirtation with imperialism in U.S. history. But these arrangements for these territories still existed, and this history still happened, and so it does not fully fit that anti-imperial U.S. narrative. There are remnants of a history when the United States was openly experimenting with overseas expansion. That history feels a lot less distant today. So bringing this back into the present, we've heard a lot from the current Trump administration about discussions about American power in the context of territorial control and sovereignty that have resurfaced in ways that were completely taboo even in the last administration. Talking about acquiring Greenland, acquiring mineral rights and territories all around the world, controlling political outcomes in Cuba, turning Canada into, in Panama, turning Canada into the 51st state. This reflects what could possibly be a transitory change in tone of American foreign policy that has shifted towards transactional leverage and strategic assertion, using the language of power politics and territorial acquisition. So the Hawaii-Puerto Rico comparison sits right in the middle of that debate. Hawaii's statehood did not preserve indigenous sovereignty. Political incorporation came with cultural transformation and demographic change. Large portions of land passed into corporate or outside ownership. Tourism reshaped the economy. Statehood provided representation, but it did not restore what had been lost in annexation. Puerto Rico, in contrast, has avoided full incorporation. It has also avoided full independence. It remains in an ambiguous position, and that ambiguity is what the song is about. It is not arguing directly for one status outcome. It is warning about drift. What happened to Hawaii is a shorthand for loss of control over land, identity, and long-term political direction. That concern is not simply formal annexation, but a gradual transformation without the consent of the governed. So when Ricky Martin sang that line on one of the most watched stages in America, he was not making a partisan statement, but a historical one. The U.S. once debated openly whether it should become an imperial power. Figures like Mark Twain and perennial Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan opposed annexation. Others argued that strategic expansion was necessary for national strength. That argument was never fully resolved. It was absorbed into American institutions and then largely forgotten. The reason it resonated is that Puerto Rico's status remains unsettled more than a century later. Multiple referendums have produced mixed results. Congress has never acted decisively. Meanwhile, economic pressure, federal oversight, migration, and property ownership changes continue to reshape the island. The broader point is not about music, it's about continuity. America's early 20th century territorial expansion created long-term constitutional and political arrangements that still exist. They are not accidents, they are policy decisions that were never fully revisited. And so as the U.S. reasserts itself globally in more explicit power terms, those earlier choices feel less abstract. The Superbowl moment was symbolic because it placed that history into mainstream culture. A song about Hawaii became a conversation about Puerto Rico. And that's the underlying question. If Hawaii represents incorporation at the cost of sovereignty and Puerto Rico represents autonomy without full political equality, what is the long-term American model? Is it integration, independence, or permanent ambiguity? The song does not answer that question. It simply asks whether Puerto Rico will repeat Hawaii's trajectory. The fact that it had to be asked on a halftime stage tells you the debate is no longer confined to academic circles. It is part of the national conversation again.